All right, today we pick up with Mughal India. India is going to be invaded by the Turks and the Mongols. The leader is Babur, who is a descendant of Genghis Khan, famous invading tribe or invading people. They invade a lot of places. They get into Europe and China and all over the place. So he is going to carry on his ancestors' tradition of conquering territory, and he's going to conquer India. His grandson, whose name is Akbar, is going to make the Mughal Empire great. He's the one who really brings it to the peak that it becomes. He is going to win the support of the Hindus because he's very tolerant of their religion. He also will open up government jobs to Hindus, which is a show of trust of them. And he's going to end the tax on non-Muslims. So all those things are going to make the Hindus really like him. But he also is going to modernize the army, and he encourages international trade. So all of those things are going to help make India under the Mughal rule or under the Mongol rule very, very successful. Now, his son Jahangir is a weak ruler, and his wife Nur Jahan is the real power behind the throne. And so she's the one who's going to be kind of controlling things. And so she is going to orchestrate it so that her son, Shah Jahan, when he takes over, he is going to have basically very little to do and lots of money to spend. Well, Shah Jahan's wife is going to die in childbirth with their 14th child, so poor woman, but she does die in childbirth. And so Shah Jahan is probably best known because he builds a memorial to her, and that memorial is going to be the Taj Mahal, one of the iconic places of India today. So really that's all that he did that was important. But as the time goes on, we're going to see more and more contacts between India and Europe. Before the 1700s, there's very little contact between the two, but those that visited India were very impressed by India's luxury goods, by their clothing and their spices and all kinds of stuff. When they meet the Europeans didn't have very much that they could offer India that India didn't already have. India already had spices, they already had shipbuilding techniques, they already had textiles, so there really wasn't a whole ton that they needed from the Europeans. However, a civil war at the end of the Mughal Empire is going to cause turmoil and will drain the resources of India. And so now they're going to need stuff. And so this creates the perfect opening for the British and the French. And what the British and the French are going to do, they don't get along, they don't like each other, so they're going to make India weak so that they can go in and take over bits of it. And how they make it weak is they're going to play rival princes off of one another by stirring up rumors and creating controversy. And eventually the British and the French are each going to have their own sepoy, and a sepoy is an army of Indian troops. So they recruit their own Indian soldiers to fight for them. And the British and the French each will have their own, and they will compete with each other until war breaks out in Europe in 1756, and then they have to worry more about the war in Europe. However, eventually the British are going to push the French out of India, and they will establish rights to build forts and to raise armies in India. So the British are going to take over India. Once they are in India, they organize the East India Company. By the mid-1800s, it will control almost 60% or 3/5 of India. And how they're able to do that? Well, the British took advantage of the diversity within India. They use that caste system, and they use the different religions that are available in India and play people off of each other so that the British can gain more and more control. Now, the main goal of the British in India is to make money. They are there for the goods that India can provide that they can then send back to Europe and make tons of money off of. But they're also there, while they're there, they're also helping to improve the roads because that helps them with their trade. They also try to keep the peace because they don't want to be constantly fighting wars. Wars are expensive. But they also help to reduce crime, and they try to bring about social change like ending slavery and easing up on some of the restrictions of the caste system. So they are trying to do some good things while they're there. Eventually, the Indian people aren't very happy with this, and the Sepoy Rebellion will take place. Now, remember, the Sepoys are groups of or armies of Indian troops that the British controlled, and they are going to resent the British interference and domination in India. And so, in the 1850s, the East India Company is going to have some restrictions or things that it requires the Sepoys to do. For example, number one, it's going to require the Sepoys to serve anywhere. And that could be in India, but it could also be in Africa, it could be in Europe. They are required to go wherever the British leaders tell them to go. The second thing is that there's going to be new laws that allow Hindu widows to remarry. Now, if you remember from the Hindu religion, upper class Hindu women were not supposed to remarry. They were only supposed to know one man, kind of thing. In fact, it was expected that they would throw themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. The third thing is that the East India Company is going to issue new rifles. And the troops are told that in order to load these new rifles, you have to bite off the tips of the cartridges before you load them. It was something every rifle at that time you had to do in order to make it function. The problem, however, for the Sepoys is that the cartridges were greased with animal fat for preservation. And cows were considered sacred to the Hindus, and pigs are forbidden to Muslims. So no matter what meat whatever animal they were using, it's going to offend one religion or the other. And so when these Sepoys refuse to bite off the tips of their cartridges and load their rifles, they are dismissed. They are sent home without pay. Now, for some of them, this was their only occupation. This is the only thing they had going for them. And so that's going to lead to a rebellion, and they rise up against the British officers. And it's a violent uprising. It will lead to a massacre of British men, women, and children, very brutally massacred. But eventually this revolt will be crushed by the British. The British send in their military, and they crush this rebellion, and they take revenge by torching the villages, and many Indians are going to be slaughtered as a result. Now, the legacy of the Sepoy Rebellion is that there's a lot of fear and hatred and mistrust on both sides for the British and the Indians. But it is going to change British policy. India is going to be put directly under British rule and not the rule of the East India Company. And so the British are going to send in more troops to protect the people, and they're going to tax the Indians in order to pay for all those troops to be there. And so it's in this time period, roughly the 1850s, 1860s, that India becomes the brightest jewel in the British colonial crown. It is the one that gets the most resources. It's the one that gives the British the most resources. And it is a very unequal partnership, but it is all to the British benefit. Now, the British only wanted money. They needed a market to sell things, and they needed a source of raw materials. But in order to carry that out, they also created better roads. They created a railroad network that was not there before. Communications like telegraphs and waterways like the Suez Canal will all come as a result of India being under British control. They also will improve agriculture, although cash crops like cotton and jute are going to be grown rather than food items. There will also be massive deforestation because they're cutting down in order to make room for these cash crops. But they'll also see some medical improvements as well. So there's kind of a give and take that some things are good and some things are bad that they bring. But for India, they're going to see a huge population growth because of all these improvements. It not only helps the British, but it also improves Indian lives as well. But there is a strain on the food supply because farms are growing cash crops and not food crops. And slowly the Indian people begin to sink into poverty. So the Indians and the British, two different cultures, how do they survive together? Well, one of the early leaders of the Indian culture is a man named Ram Mohan Roy, and he's a scholar, very well educated, but he felt that India could learn from the British, that India could benefit from the British being there. He condemns the caste system. He doesn't like child marriage. He doesn't like the seclusion of women. He doesn't like the idea of a Sita. So all kinds of different things that he felt were negative about the Indian culture that could be changed and improved by interacting with the British. He also will help to revive pride in Indian culture but the good things, things like the Hindu religion and the Buddhist religion and those kinds of things. And so he is seen as the founder of Indian nationalism, that pride in your country, wanting it to succeed. And so we will see growing nationalism in India. The Indian National Congress will be created, and it believed in peaceful protest in order to make gains, to gain more freedom. They wanted greater democracy for Indians. And so they're going to help to support self-rule for India, that they don't need to be a colony of Britain anymore. And so it is going to be a big proponent of Western modernization, that if they could modernize and be equal to, or at least close to equal to, the British, then maybe they would let them go. Also, about the same time, the Muslim League will be created, and the Muslim League wanted a separate Muslim state. They didn't trust the Hindus, so they wanted to be separated out. So India continues to seek self-rule, and they will have lots of protests against British rule, lots of riots and attacks on British residents. And one of the most famous will come at a small town called Amritsar. At Amritsar, a peaceful crowd is gathered together inside a walled sort of park in the middle of the city. However, meetings had been banned by the British government, and so Reginald Dyer, the British commander at Amritsar, is going to go into the city with 50 soldiers, and they will surround the park, and they open fire on this crowd of men, women, and children. They kill 379, and wound about 1,100 more. Now, the excuse that was given at the basically the trial afterwards, or the hearing afterwards, was that this was to make an impression that meetings were not allowed and you shouldn't hold them, and to produce a sufficient moral effect that the people will, stop trying to become independent. But Amritsar turns out to be a turning point. The Indians at this point are convinced that the British are evil, that they will never let them go. Adding to that is World War I. World War I breaks out in 1914, and millions of Indians are going to be forced to serve overseas, and they see a very high rate of casualties. They don't fare so well. But they had also been promised that they will have greater self-government after the war, that they will start to gain more and more freedom after the war as long as they serve. But after the war, there's only minor reforms. And on top of that, you had the crackdown on the protesters, which is going to lead to Amritsar. And so that is the situation that is going to lead to new leadership and greater ideas of independence for India.